Well, the globalist agenda in Europe is connected to both the war in Ukraine against Russia and the war in the Middle East against Iran, and frankly, by implication, almost everybody else in the region, plus Russia and distantly China. So it seems as though we're lined up for some sort of confrontation. And in the Middle East, I think you're going to get that. You'll see the outbreak of some war between Israel and Iran, and eventually it will include us. Now, where does that go? How does that turn out? It's too soon to know.
Well, I've seen some reports from was it 3-4 weeks ago that the United States have pulled out of two of its more vulnerable bases in Iraq, at least vulnerable to Iran. How likely do you think there is that we could be walking towards another Iran war?
Well, I predicted it would happen probably late September, beginning of October. It could take a little longer to come about, but I think we're on that road. Look, if you're Netanyahu, your calculus is as follows. Right now, he has absolutely undisputed control over the United States, Congress, the White House, and by definition, the American military and intelligence establishments. Now, how much longer that will last is probably on his mind. Israel and the Israel lobby have not endeared themselves to the American people. You have a number of other things happening inside the United States that have deeply troubled and in many cases angered Americans. Obviously, the Charlie Kirk assassination is one of those because there are many, many people believe that Israel was prominent in orchestrating that. I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea, and I'm not looking into it because I've got so much else to do. But that's a growing perception. The 9/11 issue has come back into force, and large numbers of people are beginning once again to point to Israel's heavy hand in that. This is all bad news for Mr. Netanyahu and his government and what's happening. Now, to that has to be added our fragile financial system and our flat lagging economy. Contrary to popular belief, whatever Trump says, no, we're not going gangbusters and the economy's not soaring. And our financial situation is very, very fragile. So if you're Mr. Netanyahu, you might as well take advantage of the opportunity that you have right now, which is to use the United States as the source of your military power and go after your principal adversary, which in their minds is Iran. Now, the problem with that is that there are other developments, and you're familiar with this. You know about the Saudi Pakistani Strategic Mutual Defense Pact. That's not really as much news as you would think. The Pakistanis have a long-standing relationship with the Saudis. The Saudis have pumped a lot of money into Pakistan, if for no other reason, to build lots of madrasas that are radical Islamist schools. Pakistan is in the forefront of this Islamism. So they have a mutual admiration society going. The Pakistanis, they have a very good reputation as soldiers. They're competent military people. The Saudis are not, and they're a nuclear-armed power. And the Pakistanis have always advertised their nuclear capability as the quote-unquote Islamic bomb. Now, Pakistan also has a very long-standing and close relationship with Turkey. And initially, Turkey, particularly Ataturk's Turkey, the secular state, was a model for Pakistan. Well, that has changed, obviously. And today, Turkey is much more Islamist, and their relations have grown closer. And Erdogan knows very, very much that if he needs a nuclear weapon, the Pakistanis will deliver it. So now you have three things happening. You've got the Turks and the Saudis working with the Pakistanis that could go nuclear very quickly as powers with nuclear warheads on missiles. Then you have Iran, which has not been idle since the 12-day war. Many of the weaknesses that were detected during that 12-day period have been identified and repaired. Not to perfection, but certainly 80%, which means their integrated air defenses are now much, much better. Their relations with Russia and China have grown closer. And if you're Russia right now, in view of Mr. Trump's comments and statements, which were frankly outrageous, your incentive is not necessarily to compromise with anyone, but to tighten your relationship with China, India, and Iran. So all of these forces are operating against Mr. Netanyahu. We've seen Chinese exercises with the Egyptians. We now have the Turks and the Egyptians talking and cooperating. This, too, is very dangerous to Israel because they've always been able to sort of regard their Egyptian flank as relatively secure. It's not. Now, that's their fault because they intended to open the border and push all of the Palestinians into the Sinai Desert. And the Egyptians are not going to go along with that. So this whole 73 peace treaty has effectively begun to break down. But the fact that the Chinese are cooperating closely with the Egyptians suggests that it won't be long before state-of-the-art theater ballistic missiles, cruise missiles show up in Egypt that could be launched against Israel. So Israel sees itself as surrounded. So what do? You attack. And whom do you attack? You attack the biggest and most dangerous adversary, and for them, that's Iran. So I think a war with Iran is inevitable. The question is, who else becomes involved now, given all the relationships that I just described? We haven't even talked about the financial, economic implications because the Chinese, as you know, do a land office business with the Saudis and the Emirates for oil and gas, as well as with the Iran. So the Chinese are now going to establish a quote-unquote multi-jurisdictional gold vault in Riyadh, along with another multi-jurisdictional gold vault in Hong Kong. Now, this is apart, separate from, and beyond the Shanghai Gold Exchange. What this is designed to facilitate is trade across international lines that is backed by gold. So if you're going to sell or buy something from the Saudis, let's say the Saudis are going to sell oil and gas to the Chinese, they're going to do that business in the yuan. And the yuan is immediately backed by gold. So within that warehouse of gold that sits in Riyadh, a certain amount of gold is then moved to the Saudi side of the warehouse when the deal occurs. And when the Saudis purchased state-of-the-art missiles, radars, and other equipment for the Chinese, gold is moved to the Chinese side of the warehouse. I mean, this is a very simplistic explanation, but that's where we're headed. It's all about de-dollarization. And de-dollarization is now proceeding at a horrendous rate. As I'm sure you saw in the X that I wrote, I tried to talk about that. And I was just listening earlier today to Alistair MacLeod in London talk about the dollar's purchasing power essentially dropping precipitously. All of these things suggest that if you are Netanyahu, it's time to act. And I think his visit to the United States next week is part of that. He's coming here to finalize the plans for that assault on Iran. He's got to do that sooner rather than later before he risks losing the unconditional support of Washington. And of course, we are pulling through the bankers in New York City and the City of London, Europeans into the fight on Israel's side with us. Now, what does that mean? Probably not a lot, but it suggests that what you mentioned up front about the Europeans is accurate. Now, the final piece of all of this is how does this relate to Ukraine? And it's interesting that the same people who want to wage this war in the Middle East in Washington are the same people who want to keep the war going against Russia in Ukraine. And it appears that Donald Trump, within the space of the last, 6, 7, 8 months, has transformed into Joe Biden #2. And whatever he was elected to do has turned out to be irrelevant to what he does as president.
Well, on the topic of Ukraine, there seems to be a growing risk now of a direct war between the Europeans and Russia. That is, the rhetoric has become increasingly belligerent. The Europeans are threatening to shoot down Russian jets. Russia is warning that this would mean war. And you had all these incidents. Allegedly, Russia sent drones into Poland, jets over Estonia. Of course, this has been combined with incidents such as what they claimed was the scrambling of the GPS signals of von der Leyen's flight, which was proven to be a hoax. And a hoax the media got quite excited about, as this was the smoking gun. But anyways, there seems the whole eagerness of seeing or proving any Russian belligerence is a very concerning indicator on its own. How do you see this growing tensions? I said Europeans and Russia because the Americans seems to be wanting to sit this one out.
Yeah, I think that's a good characterization of what Donald Trump said. First, let's be sure that in the future, if they're going to scramble GPS signals for the aircraft that van der Leyen is on, please don't bring her to the United States. That's my one request. We can do without von der Leyen. Second point is, I went over today with some people in the intelligence committee, all of these accusations, allegations, you call them. There have been no Russian provocations whatsoever. None. The Russians have not violated anybody's airspace with their jets. They've been scrupulously careful, let's put it that way, cautious on the air defense identification zone and its borders. The Baltic states seem to have a permanent interest in dragging the United States into war on their behalf against Russia. And that was the comment that came through very clearly. The Poles seem to be in the same business. These 19 drones, several of them that were recovered that you could pull the SIM card out of, the SIM cards were Polish or Swedish. They weren't even Russian. So the supposition is this was a hoax created in Ukraine. In other words, a false flag. Now, I guess the Poles were part of it because the Polish foreign minister was quick to make all of these ridiculous threats against the Russians on the basis of a supposed violation that never happened. But Sikorsky's married to Anne Applebaum, and she's a card-carrying member of this globalist agenda crowd. So, it's all nonsense. The Russians have gone to great lengths to avoid any conflict with NATO and the United States. Now, we, on the other hand, have not been quite as scrupulous. But the point is, Mr. Putin is not looking for a war with us. Now, the rhetoric, and I think it's important that you bring that up. Does the rhetoric matter? Well, yes, it does. There's now a new call in Moscow for mobilization of 18 to 25-year-olds. So we're talking about a Russian military establishment that's already extraordinarily large and powerful and well-equipped, well-led, well-trained, now receiving fresh blood, if you will, making it potentially down the line even more dangerous. And this is really the result of everything that we in Washington and our friends in London have pushed on Europe. We've created the very thing that we said we didn't want. That Russian military establishment that exists today, which is very formidable, did not exist 3.5 years ago, as you know. It does now. It's very real. But we got to look at what President Trump said. It's very interesting. It looks like President Trump has abdicated his leadership of NATO to, quote unquote, others. He's effectively said, well, we'll sell you whatever you want. You can do with it as you see fit. That's your show, and we're going to effectively sit this out. Well, there are a couple of problems with that. First of all, I don't know how much money the Europeans have to spend. They may not be able to afford whatever it is that we're sending to them. Secondly, our inventories of missiles and radars and other things are down. Our production lines are not like Russia's. They don't hum 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in a huge manufacturing base devoted to military power. So I'm not sure what it all means in the short run. It may not mean very much, but the globalists absolutely have to keep this going. All you had to do is look at the 800,000 British citizens on the streets of London. Look at the tens of thousands of French citizens in Paris. Look at the attitude of the broader electorate towards these globalists running their country. People that have opened the borders, people that want to change the laws, that are doing everything in their power to castigate, oppress their native population in favor of foreigners, and to effectively destroy national culture, national identity. That's the larger globalist agenda. If you listen to Hariri, who's the priest in the high church of globalism, it's very obvious. We used to call this Bolshevism. This is what Trotsky and Kamenev and Radek and the rest of them all dreamt of, erasing all of these identities, declaring everything as artificial constructs, which it's not. There's nothing artificial about language, race, ethnicity, religion, or culture. Those are real things. Those things define us as human beings. So you're having the European population, whether it's in Ireland or England or anywhere else, wake up and say, wait a minute, we didn't sign up for this. This is not what we want. And Russia, as we've talked about before, is the last bastion of a national state that refuses to assimilate into the amorphous mass of nothingness that the globalists want to create. So they're going to continue to push for confrontation, verbal or otherwise. But my point is, right now, they have nothing to bring to the fight. The Lilliputian armies in Western Europe are no match for the Russians. The idea of putting them on the ground in Western Ukraine is absurd. They can't sustain themselves for 100 kilometers. And the Russians will target them and destroy them if they do it. So I think most of the threats are just nonsense. It's designed to beef up morale, to create the illusion that Russia is a threat. It's not. And to try and divert and distract people from what's happening in their own countries, because the enemy that the Europeans have is inside their borders. It's not Russia.
Well, you hinted towards the tweet or Truth Social post of Donald Trump, in which he argued that he finally understands the war in Ukraine, and Ukraine is winning. Ukraine can take all its territory back. It can even take more, assuming he's referring to taking Russian territory. Russia is possibly a paper tiger. Well, again, what do you make of this tweet?
Well, it's back to what I said before. He's not going to fight the battle with the Europeans over whether or not that's true. Obviously, that's all false. The war is effectively won on the ground in Ukraine. There's no question about that. The Russians are the ones exercising restraint. They don't really want to cross that river. But I do think they will take Odessa in the near term. And once they've done that, the question is, do they go up to the edge of the river and then plan on crossing into Kiev? I mean, Donald Trump is effectively saying, I don't care. It's not my problem. This is the issue. I mean, you hear all this nonsense about he's the leader of NATO, the largest alliance in the world. Well, he doesn't want to be the leader. He's made that very clear. Now, Prime Minister Orban spoke within the last couple of days, gave a very interesting speech in Budapest. And he said the Europeans need to be prepared to go to Moscow. That's where you have to go if you want to end this war. You have to realign your thinking. So you're going to have to go to Moscow. And he said, don't bother going to Washington. Nothing's going to change there. They're not going to help you. He's right. And I think privately, President Trump would like, over time, sooner rather than later, to move more and more forces in Europe out and back to the United States. I know he does. He'd like to do that in Northeast Asia as well. And we have an opportunity now because the new liberal nationalist government in Korea would very much like to see us leave. They're too polite to tell us to get out, but they will certainly facilitate that. And they want command and control of their own forces on the peninsula, which they should have had 25, 30 years ago. This is ridiculous. So these forces that are moving in the United States are moving away from confrontation with Russia. That doesn't mean it couldn't happen. And if he sells them Standard Missile 6, essentially hypersonic attack missiles that can penetrate whatever they've got out there and lets the Ukrainians or their mercenaries or whoever operate these missile batteries, that's very dangerous. Because it would be as though we were allowing the Chinese, for instance, to set up missile batteries in Mexico and launch against Phoenix, Arizona, or Dallas, Texas. No, that's outrageous. We would strike back. Well, the Russians will strike back if this nonsense continues. They try to attack Ryazan or Kazan or any number of different cities in Russia. So the danger is not past. But the reality is forces are moving in a direction that is actually advantageous to an end to the war, and he's letting the Europeans figure that out the hard way. So maybe a coalition of the willing will eventually emerge in Europe, and it has to include Germany to be workable. And it'll go to Moscow and put an end to the war. But right now, doesn't look good.
Yeah, I noticed that initially when Trump made his huge statements about Ukraine winning, you could almost hear the champagne being popped across European capitals. But then I think it's slowly sinking in that he's been suggesting that that there should be crippling sanctions on Russia, but of course the Europeans will have to do this first, which they can't. He said that
Right.
Ukrainians can take back all their territory, but this will have to be financed by the Europeans. And of course, the Europeans can shoot down Russian jets, but he will have to consider whether or not this is something that the US would support. So it, I said it was yesterday on the program of Judge Napolitano that I think the Europeans will soon realize that this was not the great support which they initially thought. And a few hours ago, the Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, he had this message which came out. He writes, President Trump stated that Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, could reclaim its entire territory. Behind this surprising optimism lies a promise of reduced US involvement and a shift of responsibility for ending the war to Europe. Better truth than illusions. That's the end
Well,
of
he said shift. He said shift. I simply say Trump has abdicated his responsibilities as the leader of NATO to the members of the alliance. What kind of alliance is that then? It's not much of an alliance. But then again, NATO is not going to survive this anyway. Neither will the EU. That's what Orban is effectively telling the other Europeans. It's time to look into a different future. It's time to move past the old Cold War solution and into a new world. And I think they can do it. But, if the Poles are going to stop any transportation of goods from Northeast Asia via rail through the One Belt, One Road project, that's not going to help matters. All the Europeans are going to end up doing is increasingly isolating themselves from everything. In the United States, we can't debase our currency fast enough. How much longer this can go on is anybody's guess. But given where gold is going and where the dollar is going, the dollar's purchasing power is dropping like a rock, and the world is turning increasingly to gold. Gold remains the anchor. It retains value. Fiat currency is easily diluted, and that's what you're watching in the United States. And of course, the economies in Great Britain, Germany, and France are terrible. The gilt market or the bond market in London is just going to fall apart and crash. Our bond market's not far behind. All the proverbial chickens are coming home to roost. So hopefully, if you were President Putin, you realize what's going on. You do what you need to do, prudent measures to protect yourself. But I think he understands that the opponent is crumbling internally. It's disintegrating inside itself. And again, I go back to Orban. That was his message. And he's right.
We mentioned the collapse of NATO and the European Union. Do you think this will be a very triggering factor? This that Trump now, well, I guess, hands over all responsibility to the Europeans? Because I know you and I have spoken about this before, that that Trump's been preparing to hand over the whole mess to Europe so they can take responsibility. But usually you don't hand over responsibility if you think you're winning. Uh, so, do you think this will be the trigger to start, like, I guess, gradual dissolving of NATO?
To the extent that European leaders and their populations understand that the world has changed. I go all the way back to Bismarck, and they looked at alliances, and he warned against overdependence on alliances, saying, the critical questions, life and death, war and peace, have to be decided on the national level. Germany must be strong in order to deal with these issues. It cannot become dependent on others. We all know how things turned out after he left his office. Charles de Gaulle famously said that Europeans need to understand Americans live in the United States, they don't live in Europe, and the British live on an island. Continental Europe, you need to take care of yourself. You need to chart your own course into the future. All these things are happening, and that's Orban's argument. Orban and others like him, Fico and others, they're going to win this argument. They're going to come out on top. The problem for all of these states, though, is still financial and economic. And I don't know how that works out in Great Britain, France, or Germany. I suspect they're on a road similar to us, which is very frightening.
Well, I just want to get back to something you mentioned earlier. You said that the U.S. intelligence sees the drones which entered Polish airspace as being a European/Ukrainian hoax to pull America into this conflict. Have you gotten any feedback on how U.S. intelligence assess the accusation that 3 Russian jets entered Estonian airspace? Because, well, this is something that the Russians are denying. Of course, we shouldn't take it all at face value, but it does seem very strange because a few days earlier, well, not few days, but at the end of August, we saw a Reuters report saying that the Americans had told the Europeans that they would be reducing their military presence in the Baltics, which is something that the Russians would welcome. And seemingly the only thing that would prevent this would be if Russians would step up their aggressions, and suddenly jets appear over Estonian airspace. I'm not saying that it's that it necessarily is a Estonian hoax, but it sure doesn't look like this is in Russian interest to have this happen at this point in time.
Well, you're right. It didn't happen. It's a lie.
Is that verified or?
Well, that's what I'm told.
Yeah.
My sources have been very straightforward about that. They did not deliberately enter Estonian airspace. Again, you can fly along the air defense identification zone. But as you point out, you always have to ask the question, qui bono, who benefits? Is there any benefit to the Russians to stop the alliance from self-destruction? None. Let them self-destruct. But the Estonians, the Baltic littoral has always been a problem. When Germany was finally unified into one state by 1879, there was a huge lobby in Berlin arguing that the German army had to be marched east to, quote unquote, liberate the Baltic states from the Tsar. I mean, it was a very serious moment. The King of Prussia, who was then the Emperor of Germany, summoned Bismarck and said, I don't want to go to war with the Tsar. The Tsar's my friend. Russia is our ally. And he said, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. Ultimately, he brought in von Moltke, the great chief of the new German general staff, and they both gave presentations to the Reichstag. And these speeches were very good. And Moltke said, look, first of all, the people in the Baltic are not being abused by the Russians. The Tsar has been very, very tolerant and indulgent. And that was true for the time Peter the Great took over because he wanted to tax the commerce. And the Baltic states were very successful. He left the German aristocracy that ran the Baltic states in place. They became part of the Tsarist table of ranks. I mean, what I'm trying to tell you is they knew what was real and what was not. And they said, we can help ameliorate conditions. And things can be improved in certain areas, but that happens through our friendship with Russia quietly behind the scenes. So a war in 1879 between Germany and Russia was averted. And the old Kaiser went and met Tsar Alexander II at the border. They embraced, and that was the end of it. And you know, the various newspapers who were printing all of this inflammatory nonsense, both in Moscow and Berlin, were basically told to stop. So, you know, by the time you get to 1914, democratization has taken over, and it becomes harder to stop these things. The monarchs no longer have the power they did 50 years earlier. But my point is, we got to take these people in the Baltic. They're nice people. I think the world of them. I've worked with them, and say, look, you know, it's time to stop the nonsense. You've got to get along with your neighbors. That doesn't mean that you roll over and play dead. No one's asking you to do that. But don't unnecessarily provoke the Russians. And the other point was militarily, very difficult to take and hold the Baltic littoral. because you have Russia right next to you that has a vast front. You, on the other hand, have to move along through what used to be West and East Prussia up through Lithuania in order to hold the place. It's not easy. Militarily, it's a very difficult proposition. No one wants to say that, but that's true. You got to get along with your neighbor. We need to tell the Poles the same thing. When Poland was admitted to NATO, a lot of people in SHAPE headquarters where I worked liked the Poles very much, but we were concerned because of this unrelenting hostility toward Russia. Said, are we inviting someone into the alliance who could become a catalyst for war with Russia? And at the time, in 1998, 99, and 2000, nobody wanted to go to war with Russia. Nobody saw Russia as a danger. Everybody wanted better relations with Russia at that point. So I just think we have to take whatever is reported with a grain of salt. Now, we supposedly had 3 drones flown over Copenhagen Airport or in the vicinity of it. Again, we have no evidence that those 3 drones, whatever they were, came from Russia. None. We don't know where they came from. We don't know who did it. I'm very skeptical of all of these attempts to characterize these as Russian provocations for the very reason that you cite. It's very obvious that we, Americans, are not going to put troops on the ground in Ukraine. We're not going to join this war as a direct belligerent. Unfortunately, we refuse to just stand up with some measure of character and say this must stop. I, President Trump, with my allies, we will sit down, we will put together a serious counterproposal. Once we have reviewed all of the Russian security arrangements that were proposed back in December 21. We've never done that. We have never listened to the Russians. That's the biggest problem. That was President Putin's message to Ambassador McFaul when he came in. After he listened to the usual rhetoric from McFaul, he walked over and he said, the problem with you is you do not listen. We're still not listening. So instead of listening, we're maintaining the fiction that something good has happened, because how much money have we wasted on this prospect, this silly nonsense in Ukraine? How many people have lost their lives because of Washington's war with Russia? Because that's what it is. And all of the Europeans have stupidly marched down into hell with us. They've deindustrialized themselves. They've gutted their economies. They're in bad shape as a result. Instead of just stepping forward and saying, I'm President Trump, I'm the leader of NATO, I want to end this war. We're going to put proposals together. I will meet with Mr. Putin after we have studied all of his proposals. We'll give him some counter proposals. But throw this nonsense fantasy out of the 3rd floor or 3rd story building window of reclaiming the Russian-speaking portions of Ukraine or anything else from the Russians on the battlefield. That's not going to happen.
Well, what you're saying is, well, it makes common sense. My concern is that common sense hasn't really prevailed a lot over the past few years now. I mean, we're in a situation that is NATO, where we have run out of money, we've run out of weapons, we've been running out of Ukrainian soldiers, and now we see that the Americans are effectively announcing a bit covertly that they're pulling out, that this will have to be Europe's responsibility and Europe's mess. And, every day the deal will get worse. We'll see more territorial losses. The best thing we seem to be hoping for is that we can make Ukraine lose slower, but then, of course, losing more men, which risks the entire nation dying off as they can't recover. I guess I would really like to see Trump be more honest than doing this clever little scheme where he throws out some big statements while he does this. But I guess my concern is, if it was common sense, the Europeans would do as they would have done in the 19th century, sit down, come up with an agreement which is mutual beneficial instead of continuing this self-harm and the destruction of Ukraine. But there's a panic in Europe which is breeding a lot of stupidity. How are you explaining the fact that Europeans are still pushing forward, holding on to these claims by Trump that we can still win and Russia is hopeless and losing?
I think Donald Trump is one of these people that, having said something or promised something, cannot find it in himself to say, I was wrong. There has to be a different way forward. He can't do that. I don't think his donors will let him do that, because his donors want him to back Israel in its war with Iran and everybody else in the region. They want him to stay engaged in Ukraine and fight Russia. In the meantime, he's preparing to begin a new conflict in Venezuela. And that Europeans ought to take a look at that, because that's very real now. I don't know when it'll happen, but there are very foolish people in Washington who've convinced themselves that Venezuela is a pushover, that it's effectively like Panama and Noriega when we went into Panama a long time ago. It's not. It's very different. But this is unfortunately an American tactic. Instead of coming to terms with the reality of the mistake that was made, ensuring you don't repeat it, you go off and make another mistake in another place and change the subject. From the very beginning, Europeans asked me, if you're right and the Russians win, this is 3 years ago, win this war and the NATO alliance effectively crumbles, which I predicted in January of 2022, then what do you think the Americans will do? And I said they'll do what they did after Vietnam, change the subject. All the news media will stop talking about it. And they're going to begin talking about Venezuela. And they're going to trump up these ridiculous charges that Venezuela is a kingpin in the drug trafficking business, which it's not. And why we need to go there because it's so strategically important. Then they'll start talking about oil and gas and all this other business. But, you would think we would have learned a long time ago that you can get oil and gas out of the ground without parking a tank on top of it. That was the lesson of the Middle East. And you started this by talking about pulling forces out of Iraq. Well, Iraq today is a de facto ally of Iran. And when we went into Iraq in 2003, one of the points that was made is whatever you do, don't occupy the place. Don't tear it down, because all you'll do is open up the opportunity for Iran and Iranian influence to pour into Iraq. Well, what did we do? And have we learned anything from that? I recently saw some film footage of Petraeus, the former four-star and CIA director, sitting next to Jolani, the former ISIS al-Qaeda killer who is now running at least part of Syria. And he's telling him, we're your friend. We're allied with you. Really? I mean, to me, that's incomprehensible. If he'd shown up and put a bullet in the man, I would have understood that. But suddenly he's our friend? What are we dealing with? You talk about rationality. There is none. Most important, there is no coherence. There is no coherent strategy. There is no consistency. It's Donald Trump's impulses. I've had enough of this. I couldn't make peace. I'm not going to get the Nobel Peace Prize, so the Europeans have it now. But what is this, the high school? The 11th grade? I didn't make the team, so the hell with the team. The United States is in a lot of trouble. Our government is a mess. Everything is determined by donors and what the donors want. No one is thinking in strategic terms about anything. No one is thinking about where we want to be in 5 to 10 years. They're not even thinking beyond Christmas.
Well, just a quick final question, though. You mentioned that the war with Iran now seems to be inevitable. But do you think with these recent changes with the statements by Trump over Ukraine, do you think this takes us closer to war with Russia, or will this, I guess, reduce the risk?
I think it's too soon to tell. On the one hand, it's certainly encouraging to Moscow that we're going to reduce our profile. But that may, in fact, do what you've been talking about, embolden the globalists who are running the show in London, Paris, and Berlin. But they would be very foolish to do so, because they could make their countries targets for the Russians. if the Germans provide Taurus missiles, put those into the hands of Zelensky and his organized crime syndicate, and they launch those into Russia, and they attack a city like Ryazan or Belgrade or something else, what's going to happen? The Russians are going to respond as they've warned Berlin by destroying facilities in and around Germany, in Berlin. So the bottom line is it's not over yet. But if you're in Russia, it looks a little better than it did in some ways. You just want to get through this next phase with these foolish globalists, and you hope that the financial crisis and the crises inside, the social, political, economic crises inside their countries will divert their attention or distract them or ultimately remove them from power. In the meantime, they're going to watch us very carefully as we open a new front in Venezuela, which I think is sheer lunacy. But I hold the minority opinion in Washington. Everyone's very excited right now.
Yeah, it's interesting times. Anyways, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and yeah, sharing your insights. It's yeah, hopefully we'll see some common sense return both to the United States and Europe, but I don't know. I'm quite pessimistic here, like yourself. So thanks again.
Okay. Thank you, Glenn.